Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this, the 32nd meeting in 2013 of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee. Can I welcome my MSP colleagues, welcome our witnesses and welcome visitors in the gallery. And can I remind everyone, please, to turn off all electronic devices and mobile phones, or at least turn them to silent so they don't interfere with the recording equipment. We have apologies this morning from Christian Allard and Alison Johnson, and we have two substitutes, Patrick Harvey and Joan McAlpin. Welcome. Okay, item 1 on the agenda is to consider whether we will take item 5, which is a review of the evidence heard at this meeting, in private, and whether consideration of any future reviews of evidence and consideration of a draft report on access to finance should be taken in private at future meetings. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. Okay, item 2. The committee will be looking at an inquiry into Scotland's economic future post-2014. Our members content that our discussion on the remit for that inquiry be taken in private at a future meeting.
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you. Okay, item 3 on the agenda is the commencement of our inquiry into the question of access to finance, which is something which has exercised committee members for some time. I'm very pleased we are joined this morning by an extensive panel. I'll introduce everybody, if I can, from my left-hand side. We've got Colin Borland, Head of External Affairs at the Federation of Small Business, Ken Barclay, who's the Chair of the Scotland Board and Managing Director of Corporate Banking at the Royal Bank of Scotland, Alistair Gardner, who's the Regional Managing Director, Commercial Banking, Bank of Scotland. We have Ian McCall, Head of Investment and Access to Finance Policy Unit, and Roddy MacDonald, Deputy Director, Innovation, Investment and Industries, Scottish Government, and Kerry Sharp, Director, Scottish Investment Bank. So welcome to you all. We obviously have quite a large panel this morning, so I would remind members, if they're asking questions, it would be helpful if they could direct their questions at a particular panel member, or members, rather than just throwing them open for discussion, because if you all try and answer every question, it'll take us a long time to get through the business. But if you would like to come in and make a point in response to a question, perhaps asked to somebody else, if you just catch my eye, I will bring you in as best as I can. And I would ask members if they can keep their questions as short and focused as possible. And similarly, the answers as short and focused as possible. That will enable us to get through a range of topics I think we're keen to cover in the course of this morning's session. I wonder if I can maybe just start by inviting Colin Borland from the Federation of Small Business to just maybe set the scene for us a bit and say where, Colin, your members are finding the issue of access to finance at the moment, whether we hear anecdotally as committee members that it is a problem. To what extent it is a problem? Is it getting better? What the relationship with the banks and the major lenders are. So I'll open with you, Colin.
Yes, thanks very much, Convener. I think it's fair to say at the outset that I have the privilege of addressing you against a slightly more positive backdrop than I have maybe in the past. The latest figures from our members suggest that confidence is rising, and this is feeding through to investment intentions, which are firming up, which is obviously good news because an investment-led recovery is going to be far more sustainable than one that's funded on consumer debt or a housing bubble. That said, when we ask our members about how they're getting on accessing finance for their business, we still see about half reporting availability is poor and about a third saying that it's unaffordable. So availability is still the bigger issue than cost. Equally, when we look at whether members are approaching their bank or a finance provider for external sources of finance, we see that the figure is stubbornly around, it oscillates between 20 and 25%. And that has stayed the same since about 2009. What we noticed was, pre-crash, that figure was about 45%. And it fell off a cliff for reasons that are well documented, has come back up a bit, but has stubbornly stuck round about this level. I know that you're also looking today at alternatives to finance, to bank finance, and acknowledging that business finance and bank lending are not synonymous. And I looked again last night because it was a more attractive prospect than watching the Norway game. Just at the latest figure, yes, despite the result. at our members' awareness of of alternatives to bank finance, and it's fair to say that it is poor. I mean, something like only less than 30% of members in Scotland are aware of things like peer-to-peer lending and asset-based finance. And if you go through the range of options, interestingly, those figures are lower for Scotland than they are than for the UK as a whole. And that picture is repeated when you ask them about their awareness of specific alternative finance solutions.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll bring for the others, and if I can just tease out a couple of issues. Firstly, in relation to the question of alternatives, I mean, we've got here the Scottish Investment Bank, we've got here Scottish Government officials involved in this area. You know, what could they be doing better in terms of assisting your members in accessing finance?
I think it's not. When we ask the members about it, they don't tend to differentiate between the public and private sector offerings. It's just an alternative. I think one of the issues round about products offered through the Scottish Investment Bank and elsewhere is they are very specific products aimed at a very specific group of companies. They're not designed to be, and they're not going to be, an alternative to the sort of a general finance which the members of the business base require. So I think if we're going to look at market interventions, from our point of view, perhaps less specifically targeted measures may be better. However, if people aren't coming through the door and they're not asking for it in the first place, frankly, the details and designs of those schemes are of secondary importance.
Public sector schemes are really of very little relevance to your members.
Yeah.
Okay. Second question was, going back to what you said about banks lending, you're sitting on your left, you've got representatives of RBS and Bank of Scotland, who between them have 70% of the lending to SMEs in Scotland. Anything you want to say to these individuals on behalf of your members?
I think... No, I think we do enjoy a good relationship with all the major banks in Scotland. We do have an issue. I think we would recognise that we do have two dominant players in the Scottish market. I think people don't phone me up, or relatively few people phone me up or my colleagues up to tell me that they're doing great. People will usually contact the FSB if there's a problem. Therefore, the information we get back there is a self-selecting sample. And if we, so it's difficult to, I don't think it's fair to extrapolate directly from that in terms of trying to find out trends. However, what I would highlight is the deal that we've done with the British Chambers of Commerce and the Treasury to do one of the most comprehensive surveys of lending, not just from banks, but from all providers, lending attitudes to small businesses and customer service to SMEs in the UK. I think that the results of that are going to be instructive. I think it's one of the biggest surveys of its kind that's ever been done. I would urge them to look very closely at those findings and appreciate the sort of things which small business customers really value, which is the personal service, it's someone knowing about your business, it's having that named contact, it's been made to feel that your business matters. Because the last time we asked members about this in the summer, 2/3 said that they felt that the bank didn't really care about them or their business.
2/3?
2/3, 66%.
Right, well, I think I better bring in the banks to let them have a response to that. Maybe start with you, Ken Barclay. 2/3 of Mr Borland's members think you don't care.
If I may, I'll just make a few opening comments, Convener. As well as chairing the Scotland Board, as you've identified for RBS, I'm head of the Corporate Banking Division in Scotland, which is the part of the business that looks after small to medium-sized businesses along with the larger businesses right through the whole spectrum. And I think access to finance and helping all of our customers is important to us. And earlier this year, we brought in independent third parties to look at how we worked with small businesses on lending. You'll have seen the results of the output of this, which we've called the Independent Lending Review. We had already undertaken a number of initiatives, but felt that frankly, it made for pretty uncomfortable reading when it came out. We set up the review so that we could improve how we support small businesses. There's a real determination to make sure that we do that. and we are committed to acting on the recommendations which the report finds. The review comes at a time when we've got a new Chief Executive, and you'll be hearing from him here on Friday. I think that gives us a real opportunity to improve what we can do for small business customers. Now, although the review did focus on RBS, that was the request that we made of it, there are some recommendations in the report that could be considered broader and for the industry to consider, and that may be of interest to the committee at some point in time in the future. For the avoidance of doubt, we want to lend more than we are currently lending. That's a major part of our business. We will only be successful if we do that. We've taken a number of initiatives, as I mentioned, to encourage businesses to speak to us, to have a dialogue with us about their financing needs, and the independent review of lending is just one of those initiatives. Just for context, we've got 120,000 customers in Scotland, over 100,000 customers. Many don't need external sources of finance, but those that do, we have seen a general emphasis of deleveraging and paying back debt since the financial crisis. However, we are seeing some signs of recovery, as Mr. Borland identified a few moments ago, that there is a sense that new lending is something that we are seeing more of and more demands to, and we're responding to that demand. So there is an element of confidence returning. The economy in Scotland is doing better than it has done for some time, and so we want to play a part in supporting small businesses take advantage of that upswing as and when it continues throughout this year and hopefully into next. So I look forward to answering the questions that you've got.
Thank you. Arthur Garner, do you want to say something?
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Just to say, I operate the Bank of Scotland brand in Scotland, which is part of the Lloyds Banking Group, and Bank of Scotland is the brand that we use in the commercial sector, which is similar to Ken's arena, from the SME right through to the top end of the corporate space. Scotland is a key part of the sector, sorry, a key part of the economy for the bank. We're the largest private sector employer by FTE in Scotland, so it's very meaningful for the organisation. As Ken's alluded to, we've spent a long time reviewing our operational model and policies, and probably 2 years ago really embarked on changing how we operated in engagement with the businesses. And we are actually seeing some real positive signs. So as of the half year, our lending was net up 5.58% year on year against a market that was down. And how we've been able to achieve that really is by freeing up our frontline relationship directors and relationship managers to spend time with customers, because all of the feedback we get from Mr. Borland and from our customers and services is people want to spend time with the relationship teams. So we've been able to do that, and the successes of that is coming through. There is still an increasing demand for lending coming through, and we are seeing some signs of recovery. But clearly we are not yet the finished article, and we still have considerable work to do around that.
Thank you for that. I'm sure my colleagues will have questions, tease out some of what you've said and pursue it further. But I think before we get into that, I'd quite like to hear something from the other panellists. Maybe Ian McCall on behalf of the Scottish Government. I think you might have heard what Colin Borland said about public sector finance and how many of his members were not connected with that, not aware what was on offer. Is there something you can say in response to that?
I think that what we're finding is that there is an issue on both demand and supply side. I mean, some companies are postponing their borrowing to fund growth plans. They're awaiting positive market developments before making any long-term commitments. Some viable firms are unable to secure funds at the levels that they wish. And some companies are not pursuing finance in the belief that they'll be turned down. And what we would suggest to companies, small, medium-sized businesses, is to take advice before approaching the banks. Take advice from Business Gateway, from their accountants, their lawyers, because access to finance is not an automatic right, and the banks have a criteria now which is slightly stricter than what businesses have seen before. So preparation before you approach the bank is going to be really, really important. I think it's encouraging to hear that the banks want to send out positive messages to their small business customers, because it's all about business confidence. and there is some perceptions out there from a number of businesses that we need to get over. The banks are open for business, and the banks are willing to talk to customers prior to the customers actually applying for finance. And I think that dialogue is something that we should be encouraging more to improve the prospects for both sides.
When you say, when you're encouraging a dialogue, that sounds to be the sort of, woolly, wishful thinking answer that people always come up with when they're short of concrete proposals.
Not really. I mean, we're talking here about the perceptions of some businesses that the banks are closed and funds are not available to them. But the banks have supply of resources that they wish to disperse. And if the demand's there, we need to join it up a bit more positively. And I think also what we need to be very careful of is the negativity around access to finance that continues to feature in the media and the press. That has an impact on business people. That has an impact on their perceptions and their decision-making processes. So the more we can actually be positive, as Colin has quite clearly indicated, seeing positive changes emerging, we should be talking this up more to encourage people to actually look at investment, to consider opportunities, and actually look at the funding for them.
Okay, maybe Kerry Sharp, do you want to say something about the Scottish Investment Bank and what's available from you to help businesses looking to expand?
Thank you. Well, the Scottish Investment Bank is the investment division of Scottish Enterprise, as you're probably aware. We operate a couple of main tasks within the team. One is the Financial Readiness Service, which is support to companies looking to raise funding. So part of that is around supporting them and making their business propositions investable, and also part of it is in allowing them to understand funding sources are out there, what's appropriate for their business, and helping them to access them. Last year, that team supported 460 businesses, raising 56 million of funding. Now, clearly, there's a lot of businesses in Scotland, and we can't support all of them. We focus on those with high growth potential and exporting potential as those that are going to add the most to the economy. The other part of our business is actual direct funding. So we operate a number of equity funds across the early stages of the risk capital market. So last year we invested over 30 million and leveraged 60 million of private sector funding. So we're putting quite a lot of money out into the SME market just now.
In terms of, you talk about people you lend to in terms of those you identify with growth potential and who are exporting. Is that too restrictive? I mean, should you have more freedom in terms of who you lend to?
We are part of Scottish Enterprise, so our role and our remit is to try and achieve the best for Scotland. So we can't do everything for everybody, so we have to focus our efforts on where we think they'll achieve the best impact. And we believe there's a lot of evidence to support that growth and exporting companies are the ones that will provide the best to Scotland in the longer term.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to bring in Dennis Robertson, who I think has got a question about RBS.
And good morning. Maybe start with Ken. Obviously, the Royal Bank probably, well, I suggest that you acknowledge that there was a problem, hence the reason you put forward this independent lending review. Were some of the, you said it was uncomfortable for you, some uncomfortable reading. Maybe could you expand on that? And were you surprised at some of the outcomes from the report?
Thanks, Mr. Robertson. The reason that we wanted to do that, our role is to try and help as many businesses as we possibly can to try to be able to expand job opportunities in this country and to help the economy grow in its totality. There's no question of a doubt, having gone through what we went through in 2008 through until 2013, where we had to reduce our balance sheet by several hundred billion. To give you a sense, it's about half the size of the UK economy that's come off our balance sheet in the space of 4 or 5 years. We had to raise deposits to be able to equalise our loans and deposits. That took an enormous amount of effort. We get to the point where, several years in, we recognise that the pendulum probably had swung too far, or it had stuck. And we needed to do something about that. So for the last 18 months or so, We have been getting very much on the front foot, very much as Alistair described, spending more time with customers. We had identified a number of initiatives, for example, being proactive to our customers and giving them a sense as to how much we would be prepared to lend them if they had an appetite to borrow from us. But undoubtedly, since we had thought that we were making reasonable progress, some of the issues that came out of it in terms of the time that it takes, the quality of the relationship managers, the relationship with our credit function made it for slightly uncomfortable reading, as I highlighted.
We take what Mr. Borland was saying earlier. It doesn't appear that your message is actually getting through. And we're aware that there's more applications for funding, but less lending. That doesn't really square up, does it?
So if I could just take you back to the point that I made, that if you are in the process of making our organisation safe, if you're in the process of making sure that you've got the right level of debt across the whole organisation, then you've got what we established in 2008 was a non-core division. Many of the assets in that non-core division are declining and coming down over a long period of time. As a consequence of that, when you're looking at the totality of our lending to the sector, much of that is in long-term decline. If you look at the new lending that we're doing at the front book, our lending to small businesses 30% up this year relative to last year, and our role is to make sure that we continue to support those businesses that are coming in the front end. There's still a lot of exposure that we've had to commercial property that is declining and will continue to decline, and that is compensating for the businesses that we're putting on at the front end. So
what's the main barrier for SMEs coming to, say, RBS for funding? Is it your criteria for the funding? Is that a barrier, an obstacle? Is it still too complex in terms of the process?
I would observe that there certainly are some observations in the large report that it is too complex. What we have done with our relationship managers, and all of our relationship managers, and the only bank in the UK that's done this, is that we've made them accredited by the Chartered Institute of Bankers. That will allow our relationship managers to have far better and deeper conversations about understanding their business. That's been ongoing for over a year now. We will continue to do that. We want all of our frontline bankers to be professionally qualified. That's the next stage. That will allow, to my mind, far better conversations to take place between banks and customers, and hopefully that will then result in increased confidence in our customers to approach the bank and make sure that we can help them when those demands come in.
So what's the time frame for this? Because we're hearing you're getting people through a system, qualifications. I'm quite surprised to some extent that they maybe didn't have them in the first place. But what's your time frame for this? Because it would appear, you're saying business is up in some respects by maybe 30%. We're still hearing there's more people applying, less are getting. The perception, and I take on the point that maybe we should be trying to a positive perception rather than a negative one in terms of the lending sector. But we still get the impression that there are barriers. And, if we listen to FSB, and they're saying that many of their members are not aware, and to some extent, how they can access the finance. Are you really getting your message out?
You can always do more, but for example, we're working with the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Scotland with a view to establishing how best we can serve the small business community by making sure that the proposals that we get from businesses are ones that make sense for us. So we need to understand the business plan, we need to understand the cash flows of the business, we need to understand the proposal that the company is putting in front of us, and we need to be convinced that the management team have got the ability to be able to run that business and repay the bank.
More risk averse now than you were before, and this is one of the barriers in terms of you're basically trying to play safe.
Well, as I said at the outset, we needed to make our bank safe. We don't want to be in a position that we were in 2008 ever again. So that was the first step that we needed to make.
But is that encouraging entrepreneurial sort of movement? Is that really encouraging people that want to sort of move forward? And sometimes there is a risk element.
So undoubtedly that's the case. And I think I mentioned that the pendulum did swing and probably swung too far. We need to correct that. And that's something that's right at the forefront of our mind.
So what's the time frame for that?
Our new CEO is announcing to the market the financial results of RBS for 2013 in the 4th week of February. That is the time when we will be making public announcements about how we intend to take this forward in a much more proactive way.
Okay, thank you very much. Bank of Scotland, do you want to make any comments? Are you more risk averse as well? Are you lending better? Are customers coming to you because it's less complex than RBS, for instance?
I can't comment. I mean, we approve more than 80% of the applications that we've received. One of the challenges I think that's been called out before is ensuring that we educate our customers and potential customers as to what we can do and what we can't do. And one of the keys is, you know, we don't do equity on our balance sheet. We invest in LDC, we invest through the Scottish Loan Fund, and we invest through the Business Growth Fund. And I know that RBS are involved in these as well. And we need to be clear as to what the purpose and the value of debt is. And I think we also need to ensure that through the conversations that we want our relationship teams to have with customers, is we support the businesses in growth through not just debt, through other products, etc. And that, to me, is how we will help the Scottish economy prosper, not just supplying debt as one instrument.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I've got a whole list of members who want to come in with follow-up questions. I'll start with Chick Brody.
Good morning. Can I declare an interest in that I actually, in a previous life, worked with certainly two of the banks that are here as I'm now called a transitional troubleshooter, not a consultant or company doctor. Let me start with the, if I may, with the general perception, which is little to do with bank lending, but more to do with the economy, because clearly in trying to get your bank's balance sheet right, what we're seeing is lending to, again, to the property market. And I suggest that part of the problem that was alluded to by Mr. Robertson in terms of risk aversion, when it comes to lending to small businesses, while you might say that your relationship managers, and I'll come back to that in a minute, if I may, Mr. Barker, Mr. Gardner, are improving or are aware of the customer service that they offer. I have two questions around that. One is, how experienced in real business terms do you think relationship managers are? And secondly, what message is given to the credit officers in terms of looking at the risk involved in businesses, and how aware are they of what the businesses are trying to do?
I'll start, Mr. Brody, if I may. In order to ensure that our frontline relationship managers are closer to business, I mentioned that they are virtually all accredited now by the Chartered Institute of Bankers. As part of
dealt in the marketplace.
So, part of that accreditation requires them to work for 4 days a year in business, not with a view to identifying opportunities for us, but for them to understand the way that business people work and operate. And that's been very well received by businesses, and it's been exceptionally useful for our relationship managers, who now become much more aware of how business works.
We operate a slightly different model. So we have a number of key markets or key sectors, as you might describe, where we give our relationship directors fairly intensive development around those spaces. The two that I would just call out for the purpose of this committee, we put our manufacturing relationship directors through Warwick Business School, where they do a manufacturing course to allow them to be able to talk to manufacturing customers with a degree of more knowledge than they would have had historically. And we have a number of relationship directors in Scotland who have been accredited by Visit Scotland, having been through the Visit Scotland training, again to allow us to support a key sector for Scotland. And again, to Ken's point, that has been well received by the businesses. And we also operate charters for our customers, where we give a commitment to spend a designated period of time with customers if they wish our relationship directors to do.
And that's fine. I'm not overly convinced that that helps them understand the business in the market 4 days a year. But anyway, can I ask, in terms of the credit officers and the directions that are given to them in terms of how they help or how they might help small businesses?
One thing that we've got to recall that normality in availability of finance should be taken back to before 2007, and we went through a long period of fairly substantial growth from 2005 to 2007, and therefore that substantial expansion that took place at that time took us into areas where there was too much debt in small to medium-sized businesses. At that point in time, the balance of responsibility was probably with the front line rather with the credit function. I would emphasise again, when you need to make your bank safe, your pendulum probably swings too far, and therefore there was probably some good business that we could and should have done that we didn't. We recognise that. Our job now is to make sure that that pendulum for risk comes back much more into the centre, and that those people that are responsible for either writing business or sanctioning business are aware of the determinations of the business to make sure that we're on the front foot, out with customers and making finance available.
So there's no disconnect between the relationship managers and the credit teams?
I would say they're probably closer now than they have been for some considerable time.
That's encouraging. Can I ask you, just finally, in terms of both banks have 70% of the SME marketplace, how would you encourage more competition?
From my point of view, the important thing is that we look after our customers as well as we possibly can. As far as I'm concerned, if competition comes in, that's got to be a good thing for everyone. But we've got to look after our customers and do the best by them and make sure that that we're playing a role in helping the Scottish economy.
I think we'd echo Ken's comments. I mean, competition is healthy, and it would challenge us to ensure that we are performing to the top of our game.
Just before we move on, I'll maybe ask Colin Borland, from the point of view of your members, do you think there's enough competition in bank lending?
I think we have to be careful of what we mean by competition. Yes, we have two big players which dominate the SME market. Would that be any better if I walk down George Street in Edinburgh and see a different colour of sign outside some branches, if they're all essentially offering the same products at the same price? We are quite heartened by the OFT market study, because it's going to look at, I think, specifically at Scotland, but also not just about how many people have we got in the market, but at the sort of products which our members use. So I think if we're going to look at expanding or getting some genuine competition in there, we need to think about how we get other people using other models to provide a sort of realistic alternative to the main high street banks. I think that's got to be good news. And if I could add very quickly just a point about relationship managers, I think it's actually good news for the banks that our members really prize the relationship with the relationship manager. It's something that is very important to them. And I think in the past the criticism has been that they have maybe been too sales focused, and there's nothing wrong with sales, it's a very noble profession, but that possibly wasn't what they were looking for when they began the conversation. I think it's going to be very interesting to see the outcome of the joint FSB BCC Treasury report into bank levels of customer service and satisfaction with one's bank that we're going to get, because I think that's going to be a key factor in determining who tops that table.
Ms. Sharp, I wonder if I may ask you, and I've also dealt with Scottish Enterprise. We have the Scottish Investment Bank, we have the Scottish Seed Fund, we have the Scottish Co-Investment Fund, we have the Scottish Venture Fund, we have the Scottish Loan Fund. We also, as we heard 3 weeks ago in this committee, that there are 332 different funding streams. Are there any plans to try and rationalise public sector investment and, as you're aware, as you might be aware, public sector investment vehicles?
Not that I'm aware of. Certainly there are a number of products out there. Not necessarily. I think the plan and the ideal is to make it clear so that companies understand what's available and what it means. Ultimately, companies want a choice in a lot of things. They want to understand what products are right. The products that you kind of talked about there, some of them are very different. Some of them are equity products, some of them are mezz products, and there are obviously debt products out there. So, by nature, they have to be different. the business portal that's been set up, and also our financial readiness team, their role is both to make sure that the clarity is there to come, so they understand what's appropriate as well as how to get it.
So you don't think that given that number of funding streams and given with the bank relationship managers, the proliferation of business advisors or finance advisors in inverted commas, and coupled with business gateway efforts, social enterprise efforts, provides a chaotic finance scheme or access to finance scheme for businesses out there in the streets?
I don't believe so. I absolutely think there's more we can do. There's always more we can do, and we spend a lot of time trying to understand how we can do things better. We ask our companies, we ask our customers, we ask all the people that we deal with, and we always act on that and try to make things clearer. I don't believe there's a chaotic environment. I believe there's a lot out there, but at the same time, as I said before, companies are looking for choice and ability to have different products available for their needs.
What engagement, as the European rapporteur on the committee, what engagement do you have with European Investment Fund, in particular the COSME fund that is, or the updated one, which is due to be released shortly, where there is 1.4 billion euros available to assist small businesses? The rest of the UK has about 78 advisors who can access that. We have 4, one of which is Scottish Enterprise, the other is HIE, the other is West Scotland Loan Fund. And yet we, in discussions I've had in Europe, we seem to have had not tapped into that at all, other than through one venture capitalist in the south of Scotland.
So
what engagement do we have?
We have a lot of engagement. We have there's a steering group set up at the moment between a number of parties, Scottish Enterprise, Scottish Government, HIE and others, looking at, in particular at the moment, Horizon 2020 as the one that we've got immediately in our sights that we're working through how to access it.
I'm talking about the COSME investment for guarantee loans or equity for finance schemes that are available. And the information I have is, because we're not a member state, we don't access that, although we do have 4 interfaces that could, 5, if you include the VC, that could actually interface with that fund and encourage these funds to be made available.
We are interfacing. We are understanding what it's about, what it means. There's, again, a number of European sources of funding. They come with a lot of requirements. The team required to look at them, understand the benefits, understand who can access them and how, and what's the best European funding for Scotland and for companies. So we are engaged on that. There's a long way to go to understand it fully. It's not simply a case of tell companies it's there and you can go and access. Quite a lot that comes with that. We are concentrating on Horizon 2020 initially, and moving on to COSME as much more detailed analysis comes through on that.
It's interesting, when I asked that same question of a senior member of Scottish Enterprise at our away day in Irvine, he then came back to me and said he would try and get more details, and could I provide him with more details. So I'm not sure where the engagement is taking place. It certainly isn't taking place in Brussels, and I'm not sure it's even taking place meaningfully here. It might be being discussed, but given the amount of money, and if you look at the amount that countries like Germany, for example, were able to access in the previous fund, we're eons away from accessing what could be a very profitable route for us. Anyway, if I may ask one last question, Convener.
Well, if you're leaving this issue, I think we need to let Scottish Government officials come in and respond. Yeah, Mr McCall.
Just 2 things I want to mention to the committee. One is the 332 schemes that were mentioned. The Scottish Parliament, through SPICE, has produced a very good guide to the financial assistance that's available to business. Now, I haven't counted it page for page, but I don't think there's 332 schemes there. But certainly it's a very...
121. There was a witness here who said, no, you're wrong, it's 332.
Well, there's a very intensive and very informative document that the Parliament's produced itself that lays out all these schemes, which could be quite useful.
Ask how up to date that is, because we have your report here, which is in conflict with some of the other information we've got, which is Access to Finance 2012. Can you tell me how often that's updated and when it's planned to be?
Access to Finance survey?
2012, yeah.
There's no immediate plans to undertake another survey. We did undertake 4. What we've been doing is we've been looking at, since that work was completed, there's various surveys that are undertaken across the UK by British Banking Association and others that we've been digesting and looking at the position in Scotland. Now, we recently summarised these surveys and brought together all their conclusions. Now, I'm happy to share that piece of work with the committee if you find that would be helpful, and to give you an insight to what all the surveys have actually been telling us across the UK.
So can I just follow up before Mr. Brodie comes back in? That's fine. A couple of things I want to follow up. I mean, just on that last point about the SME access to finance. I mean, we've heard from the Finance Secretary when he's come to this committee, you know, the Scottish Government view this issue of access to finance as absolutely crucial in terms of economic recovery. Are you saying there are no plans to do a follow-up survey to this 2012 study?
We haven't made any decisions to do a follow-up survey.
Okay.
We're monitoring the situation and have been looking at the outcomes. Since we completed our own surveys, there's been a lot of work that's been taking place at a UK level. And even Mr Borland mentioned the survey that's taking place with FSB. And what we've been doing is digesting these surveys and extracting from them what is relevant to the Scottish marketplace. As indicated earlier, we recently, in the last few months, pulled this all together into a note that covers all the major surveys, and I'm happy to share that with the committee if that would be helpful.
Okay, that would be helpful. Can I also ask you about the point Mr Brodie made about European funding that's available? Surely it can't be the case that because we're not a member state of the EU we can't get this money. It's been accessed down south.
In regard to access to finance, I mean, we look at what's available across Scotland, the UK and Europe, and we look at the terms and conditions of the different programmes that are available to try to make the most suitable form of finance available for the SME customers. Currently, we utilise ERDF as a form of funding for most of our venture capital programmes. And we're currently in discussions with the Managing Authority about taking that forward again under 2014 to 2020 Structural Funds Programme. We are hoping that we can persuade them to formulate a financial engineering instrument purely focused on SMEs that would have at its disposal 80 to 100 million pounds. And if you take that and the match public sector funding that would go alongside that, and then add into the equation the 50% private sector funding, you're talking about a pot of maybe £500 million available to assist businesses over the next 7 years.
And when are you hoping for that to be put in place?
We're hoping that the decisions on that were made in the spring.
Okay, thank you. Right, Margaret McDougall.
Thank you. Just good morning, panel. To go back to the bank lending and direct this question at Mr Barclay, the main driver of the difference between RBS and its peers is the extent to which it screens out pre-applications. And I just wonder if there's a connection there between this perception that the business sector has because of that, because you seem to be more stringent in your screening out than your peers?
The large review identified that pre-screening wasn't necessarily a bad thing because it allows us to be able to identify fairly quickly those applications which have got a better chance of success. However, it does acknowledge that as a consequence of that, we are missing some opportunities. And so therefore we will have a look at that. And as I mentioned earlier, we will respond to in full the large review in February. And if that's one of the things that we feel is appropriate to change, we will do so.
So you recognise that there may well be a problem there with your screening?
I recognise that we may be missing opportunities to support customers, yes.
Right, and that will be rectified in February next year?
Our intention is to review the recommendations and adopt them as best we possibly can.
Okay, could I ask Mr Borland then if he thinks that that would be welcomed by the business sector, SMEs?
Yeah, I mean, it is an issue has been fed back to us, and it's not always a bad thing. As Ken says, if you can approach a bank manager and say, well, look, to be honest, Mr. Borland, this scheme is daft. You're never going to get money for this in a million years. Don't bother even putting it in and damaging your credit rating. And they give you a bit of advice like that. That's helpful. If, however, it's someone taking it upon themselves not to put it through when actually it looks like there's an arguable case there, then that's a problem. And as with a lot of this stuff today, it's about striking that correct balance. And we were too far over that way. We swung too far that way. We're hopefully going to end up somewhere in the middle, but it is taking a while.
You can expect to see this being better by early next year.
Well, our commitment, we've got the funding and capital available to support what we believe will be an increased demand over the coming months and years. We want to be able to support as many businesses as we can in Scotland to help employment and growth in Scotland. And if there are ways that we can do that better, we'll learn from those recommendations and implement them.
Can I continue? Just, I'm talking from having met with a particular business in my area where she said that she found it really difficult to get access, although the business that I'm running she's looking to extend, and there was not any clarity around which sector the banks were funding, what criteria they were actually looking for, because she would submit her business plan, that was all right, and then they'd come back a few weeks later and say, well, no, actually, you haven't got this, you haven't got that. So is there progress being made in that side of things where, you know, if an application is acceptable, but then when the bank looks into it further, it seems that it comes up with further questions or information that it's looking for, instead of asking for everything at once? Obviously, time is of the essence in business. So, is there a laid out procedure with all the criteria that's required if you're submitting a business plan? And do you have set sectors which you have preference to lending over others?
We are happy and we are prepared to write business in all sectors. We are not capped out with any limits, despite the fact that we have got a lot of property on the books. We are still doing some property lending, maybe not as much as we did, but we're still doing more. So there are no sectors that are off limits as far as we are concerned at the present time. As far as the procedures that you would want to go through, it will be dependent on the complexity of the business. I think it's very difficult to come up with a plan that says you require all of these things and once you've done all of that, we'll be able to either say yes or say no. I think what's important is that we get the fundamentals right, and that's where the Institute of Chartered Accountants can help. That's where other advisors can help, and that's where, frankly, we can do more to help. But if we've got a fundamentally strong business with a couple of years of financial statements, with a good cash flow, with a good solid business model, that's the premise for a reasonable discussion. Without those things, it makes it difficult to determine whether or not there's a proposal that's worthy of our support. We don't want to get into a situation where we say yes to everyone. We definitely will. We don't want to get back into that situation. But where there is a good proposal, we want to find a way every way that we possibly can to support it.
Mr. Boland?
I just wanted to add, one of the things we've been doing for the last couple of years is helping our members, running events for our members and helping them to effectively running a how to make the bank manager say yes guide. And a lot of the stuff that Ken says is what we're telling them, though that's not necessarily about how much security you can offer, because they might have plenty of security that they frankly don't want. It's about future projections, balance sheets, a solid business case, etc., etc., etc. That seems sensible. However, if you look at the Bank of England Agent Summary, most recent report from October, that does highlight that collateral requirements are often a stumbling block with lending to small businesses. So it's those sort of messages that lie at the root, I think, about a lot of the confusion about exactly what our members are supposed to do and exactly where they stand, and it makes the job more difficult for us to articulate.
are having a good relationship with banks at the moment, and we can expect to have an improved relationship in the future. Is that what you're saying?
Somebody once said.
Well, glad to hear that. Thank you.
Okay. Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Convener. Sticking with Mr Barclay and his pendulum, about which we've heard so much, the pendulum that swung too far. It's an image that conjures up a slightly deterministic understanding, isn't it? As though this is just something that happened. From some of your answers, you seem to be accepting that this is not the result of uncontrollable forces. This is actually about decisions that RBS has made, that in fact RBS turned the dial too far. Is that a more appropriate image, do we think?
I'll accept that as an image, that the dial was undoubtedly turned too far one way in 2005, 2006 and 2007. That there are some statistics that have been undertaken that would suggest that there was 50 billion of excess capacity in the SME market in 2007 that reduced to 25 billion. So in other words, the sector couldn't afford to service the level of debt that was in it in 2007, in fact, even in 2009. We've probably gone the other way now, but there's 25 billion short in the SME sector across the whole of the UK that we and the RBS and the banks need to do what we can to fill. So the dial, if it was turned up one way, needs to be turned down, and therefore to facilitate that money getting back into the economy.
Can I suggest that scale is a part of the problem that we've got here? If we look at this country's banking system, a financial services system, and compare it to some others in Europe, Germany, for example, 2/3 of the financial services sector, in terms of the assets that they hold, are local banks with local governance and local decision-making. In the UK, it's something like 3%. We've got a very, very centralised financial services system dominated by massive players. And so if one massive player turns its dial too far, it has a systemic effect. Can I suggest to you that one of the best things that we could do, if, for example, there happened to be a very large bank owned on behalf of the people, the best thing that we could do in the interests of the public would be to break it up not just into a good and a bad bit, but into a diverse network of local banks that serve their local cities and regions. They might share some back office functions, they might maintain some shared systems, but their governance would be local. They would be governed by people with their roots in a local community and a local economy. They'd make their decisions at a local level. And we'd see the same kind of emphasis that we see in Germany on lending into the real economy, where that's much more the core of the business rather than merely one small part of it.
Okay, I think before you answer that, I should say I'm not sure if that was a speech or a question, but it's a little bit
a proposition.
A little bit off topic in relation to asking the banks what they're doing in relation to access to finance. I don't think we can reasonably expect the representatives of RBS or Bank of Scotland to answer a proposition about an entirely different banking model, because they're here to answer questions about their business and how they are operating.
My suggestion is that the scale of these businesses is part of the problem, and I would be interested in their reaction.
Well, maybe we can have brief responses if we could.
In terms of the point raised, I mean, one of the keys for us is to bring the decision-making as local as possible. So we have substantial delegated lending authorities to our relationship teams spread throughout all of the communities in Scotland. We have relationship directors in every MSP's constituent. Those decisions are made based on knowledge of the sectors in which the customer operates, and also in terms of the regional variances between the Highlands and Islands, the central belt of Scotland, in the same way differentiate across the UK. So, we see the strength in having a locally based decision model.
I would echo that. The vast majority of credit decisions are made locally.
Within systems that are set by the bank as a whole.
Based on the recommendation of the relationship manager, they don't have to go through a credit function to get a response. So the decision is made by the relationship manager locally. We are in all the communities, as Alistair said. We've got 300 relationship managers around the whole of Scotland. They are actively engaged in local communities, and it's critically important that we maintain that engagement, because if we're not serving the communities as well as we can, then we will not be successful.
Surely you'd accept that they weren't all individually deciding whether to turn their dial this way or that. That these were decisions that RBS made which went too far in one direction. Isn't the scale something that has a systemic effect when a decision is made wrongly like that?
Well, if you get into a situation where there's too much debt in the sector, the one thing that you do is make sure, if you want to make our organisation safe, you turn that dial that you described. I would argue that we've turned it too far, and what we need to do is make sure that we turn it back to ensure that we're so that we get into that equilibrium, that we're supporting business at the right level to ensure that, that those businesses can be successful in Scotland, that they create jobs for Scotland and they create economic prosperity. We have a role to play in that, and we would recognise that there's more needs to be done.
Thank you, Convener. My questions are really for Mr Gardner and Mr Barclay. Would you agree that in many ways we've been a bit unfair to the banks, in as much as, on the one hand, we're demanding that you rebuild your balance sheets according to a much safer model, but on the other hand, we're also shouting and screaming at you to lend more money, and that really we're being unfair?
That's a challenge that we face. I think Ken has also alluded to the fact that we should not make every lending decision as an approval. That we need to ensure that we challenge and lend to the correct businesses. And that. Sorry,
just with respect, my question was: do you believe that we've been a bit unfair?
I would suggest that it is.
Yes or no would be good.
Well, what we're trying to do is support the economy to grow. So it is helpful to discuss what the banks are doing in a positive environment.
We'll come to that. We'll come to that. But just yes or no, have we been a bit unfair to the banks?
I think it's unfair to ask a question. That
okay, I thought it was a straight,
yes or no answer like that.
And if I, Convener, I'm beginning to wonder if I can't get a reasonable answer to that question. Is there any point in asking any more? But I'll persevere. Given that the resources, the funds you have available for lending are diminished from what they were previously, is it fair to say, though, that broadly speaking, you've got choices into which directions you lend? Mortgages, retail banking, personal lending, and business lending, if you have some choices there, do you feel you've got those choices right?
My observations around that question, Mr Mackenzie, are this: that we were, to all intents and purposes, a global organisation. We are now very much focused on being a retail and, let's call it, commercial business bank in the UK. We have got the funding and capital to support what we expect to be significantly greater demand than currently exists, whether it's in the retail bank for mortgages or personal loans, or indeed in the business bank for the businesses that are likely to show appetite to borrow money. There is more than enough funding and capital available to support that demand for the foreseeable future.
That's very reassuring. So in effect, then, you haven't had any choices to make, because you've got a huge pile of money to lend, and it doesn't really matter how you divide that up across the areas of lending we've described.
What I was trying to refer to was the fact that we have made a determination that the capital that was invested in other parts of our business, be it the investment bank or international banking, has reduced, with the intention of concentrating very much more on the UK to support growth in the UK, and for today we're discussing Scotland. So that's the intention. We will make decisions, we will look at our portfolio of companies and assets and determine whether or not we are overweight or underweight in any one sector at any point in time. And then to use Mr Harvey's description, we'll turn the dial up or turn the dial down if we feel that we've got too much exposure to one particular sector. But at the present time, we've got appetite to do business in all sectors in the Scottish economy.
No shortage of funding then? Big pile of cash that you're more than willing to lend and get that money out working in the economy?
There's a real determination to make sure that we meet the demand as and when it comes in to support the Scottish economy and growth and so on.
That's very reassuring then. I mean, so the crisis in terms of, I mean, you know, I'm absolutely surprised that people aren't rushing in their droves to buy your shares if that's the situation.
Well, I think the important thing is that we concentrate on making sure that there's money going out to customers, and if that results in profitable business and then the profits of the bank increase as a consequence, then that will impact on the share price. But I mean, that's I think what I'd like to be emphasising is that we want to be making available the funding that we've got to more and more customers. You can all help us in this. You can get your messages out to your constituents to say, you know, I've heard that the banks have got liquidity and capital available. Go and talk to them. I think if everybody can play a role in supporting the Scottish economy to that end.
Sure. Okay.
Can I just briefly, Mr. Barclay, that's a bit of a dream world, because I've been into some of your banks with some of my constituents, and I've seen the consequence. So the message doesn't come just from us. I think the message needs to come internally within the bank.
Well, you know, when I go up and down the country to see customers, I sound like a broken record. I'm visiting customers all the time, telling them exactly the same stories I've told Mr. Mackenzie. You know, we're not going to satisfy demand in its entirety, because there'll be some customers that we're not able to support. But you know, there is. I can but emphasise that we've got the capital and funding available to do so.
The other thing that really surprised me is that you mentioned earlier that retrospectively, some years retrospectively, discovered that the small business lending portfolio that you had back in 2005 was a very risky portfolio. Because my kind of understanding of the really risky, the toxic parts of banking were not in the small business sector at all. But it seems to be, from what you're saying, that you're now saying that it actually was.
I think what I was referring to was the fact that in 2007, there was £50 billion worth of debt in the SME sector which was not serviceable. That reduced to 25 billion in 2009, and now there's a shortage of 25 billion in the SME sector as invested in by the banking industry.
Describing a situation where that debt that was presumably lent, you know, not just willy-nilly with gay abandon, but that debt became unserviceable as a result of the credit crunch, or was it always unserviceable?
Well, undoubtedly we made some mistakes. There's no question of a doubt about that. The industry was lending too much money to the sector, and when we hit the economic buffers in 2008, very quickly it was recognised that there was too much debt in small businesses, and many of those businesses recognised that and had to take corrective action to ensure that their levels of debt came down, the same way as many households have done, and indeed the same way as many governments did.
I'd be very interested if you could perhaps send the committee a bit more information on that analysis, because it's certainly news to me, and I'm sure it'll be news to a lot of other people, that the kind of leveraging was at kind of unsustainable levels for small businesses. If I could just move on though, Mr. Barclay, because you're painting what for me is a very worrying picture, and it's one in which you describe pendulums. I mean, Mr. Harvey referred to this pendulums swinging with a kind of what seems to be quite a slow period, and you know, your own analysis of maybe what you're not doing well seems to lag quite far behind real time, and that kind of really worries me, in the sense that I would imagine that in today's world, with the IT capability that we enjoy, that you would have a much better sense of what your bank's doing in real time, so that we don't wake up one day and realise that, oh, really we've made a pig's ear of this, and the pendulum was swinging in a direction that none of us would want. Surely you monitor your bank's activities in real time.
Absolutely, and I can tell you what our exposures would be to individual sectors very frequently. We set a risk appetite for individual sectors. We know where our exposure is within those sectors, and we're able to respond to our regulator to tell them exactly where we are. I think that's a critical component of risk management. Yep. As I mentioned, in the event that we feel that demand for any one sector is exceeding our view of where our risk should be, then we'll tighten things up a little bit to make sure that it gets back into an equilibrium. So it's a very dynamic environment that we're involved in, and if we feel that we're underweight in one sector, then we can then release the dial to try.
So, and if you discover, for instance, that you're kind of overexposed to the popcorn sector and that you need to kind of rein in the horses there, you'll communicate that to all your relationship managers, and then they'll implement that policy.
Well, hopefully we won't discover that it will be a dynamic environment, so that we'll be aware of where the trend is.
Yep.
And as the trend is moving in one direction, we can do we can pull levers to ensure that we get it back into an equilibrium.
Haven't you just said to Mr. Harvey that decisions are taken locally and not centrally, as you've just described?
That's exactly the case. Yes. So it is the case, but
surely these are diametrically opposed systems of management.
No, they're not. They're not diametrically opposed systems, because at the front end of the business, the popcorn sector, as you describe it, the business will come in. The centre will be able to determine what our exposure to the popcorn sector is. If we feel that we've got too much exposure to the popcorn sector, then we'll go back to the front line and tell them that we've tightened up the certain aspects of lending into that sector, and therefore it becomes, we then can manage our portfolio on a much more dynamic basis, so that the decisions can be made locally, but they'll be made within the confines of a policy which potentially changes as a result of an overexposure to one sector.
Okay, thank you.
Dennis Robertson's got a follow-up.
Yeah, more or less just on the sector question, Mr. Barclay, but again, it's probably something that would be open to Mr. McCall and Ms. Sharp. The exposure to the sector, do you see 2014 as an opportunity, as a year of opportunity, especially within the tourism sector? And are you focusing some of your efforts in trying to have this open door, we're here to lend, aspect? Are you taking 2014 as a year of opportunity?
There's some big events happening in Scotland in 2014, and we're actively working with the Tourism Board in Scotland and with many of the companies that are involved in that industry, with a view to establishing where we can help.
I still get the message from constituents, especially within, say, the hotel trades, that they're looking at, maybe expansion or developing their business, and they're actually knocking on a closed door.
If you've got any specific examples that you were able to share with me and with us, I'd be very happy to look into them.
In terms of in terms of Scottish Government and that sort of area within the tourism, is this an opportunity to encourage small businesses to invest? Is Gateway sort of being proactive? Is Scottish Enterprise being proactive?
I mean, I'd like to think they were. I mean, obviously 2014 with the Ryder Cup and Commonwealth Games is a huge opportunity for the economy of Scotland. So yes, I think that the answer is yes, that all these agencies would be looking to the tourism opportunities that are in Scotland and to promote those sectors.
I'm surprised to some extent you're not saying, actually, because it's 2014 is just around the corner, that you've actually had a substantial increase in inquiries in that sector. I mean, surely we're not waiting till 2014 happens and then they've missed the opportunity. So what I'm basically asking is, has there been a substantial increase on people coming, on businesses coming for lending for 2014, taking in things like Commonwealth Games, Ryder Cup, etc., homecoming? In the banking sector, has there been a significant increase?
I'm happy to, as I mentioned before.
Wavering at the moment and doesn't know what direction it's going?
But I think there's two things I would say. Is one of the things that we've worked very closely with Visit Scotland, and that's why a number of relationship directors and relationship managers accredited. We are seeing an increase in inquiries and in demand, and we're working with them. And the key is not just about 2014. I mean, 2014 creates the window of the world on Scotland, but it's how we then support that sector to deliver in 2015 and beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. But surely it's opportunities that's perhaps there for, and we're looking at sustaining economic growth within the sector. And tourism is obviously something that's very close to this committee, but in terms of the growth within the Scottish economy, it's extremely important.
Yeah, and it's one of a number of key sectors. So, as I called out before, we operate a number of key sectors, tourism is one, manufacturing another, oil and gas services, and we engage with Scottish enterprise around those. So.
Okay, conscious we are a bit behind schedule. I've got some members still to come in with questions. So, Joan McAlpin.
This is to further develop the theme that we've been looking at, and tourism. The Scottish Enterprise Access to Finance survey in January to June 2013 doesn't show tourism doing particularly well, and shows a wide variety between different sectors. It shows, for example, tourism, about 38% of businesses attempted to access finance. Only half of tourism businesses were successful. But if you look at the financial and business services sector, 21% of them attempted to access finance, and they had an 86% success rate. And that doesn't strike me that there's been a big change in culture when it's so much easier for people in financial and business services to access finance than people in tourism.
If you've got a good business and a good business proposal, then it's incumbent upon us to take the proposal seriously. If we are uncomfortable that there is a sustainable venture that may well have an opportunity in 2014 or 2015, but then we can't see that there's an ability to be able to service debt after that, then is it in the best interest of that company to be borrowing money in the way that they're seeking from their banks? So that would be a reason for saying no to a particular application.
So you're obviously a lot more positive about people working in the financial and business services sector in terms of their outcomes and their ability to repay the debt than people in other sectors. I mentioned tourism, but for example, life sciences is an area which is obviously really key to our plans for the growth of the Scottish economy and diversification of the Scottish economy. Now, only 53% of life sciences businesses were able to raise the required amount of capital, compared again to 86% of financial and business services.
There's a maturity around the industry on that point. The risks in life sciences are much, much higher. Fewer companies are successful, but when they are successful, they're enormously successful. But typically those businesses are served by and serviced by a different kind of capital, which is equity capital. And so therefore coming to a bank when you are still in the throes of determining whether you've got a sustainable business is often a challenge that life sciences businesses will have.
But do you think perhaps there's a lack of imagination, a lack of risk-taking when it comes to these new businesses, these new sectors?
Well, first of all, what we don't want to do is find that we're lending to every sector and every company within every sector, because that's not going to be the right way for them to borrow. If they get into financial difficulties, they will not be able to service their debt. If you have to look at the prospects for a business and determine whether or not they've got the right, what I would describe as a capital structure. And very often they won't have the ability to be able to service debt. And that's why I said it earlier on, that if you've got a business plan, let's understand your cash flows, let's understand your track record, and then we've got a much better chance of having a successful outcome for all concerned.
The Access to Finance survey also shows a wide variety of success in access to finance across the country. I represent the south of Scotland, and only 50% of businesses there were able to access the required amount, compared to 70% in the west of Scotland. That seems to me to be a huge variety, particularly given that more businesses in south of Scotland tried to access finance than in the west of Scotland, but they had a far lower success rate. Would anybody care to explain why that geographical?
Could I Just off about the figures you're referring to are the ones which are in the appendix in the SPICE report. Now, SE colleagues will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's from the SE Access to Finance survey, which was done with about 1,056 account managed companies. It's probably worth bearing in mind that's 1,000 of the stable of 2,000 elite account managed companies in Scotland. We've got 340,000 businesses in Scotland. So therefore, while the figures are interesting, I think I would be wary about extrapolating too much from that to tell you what's actually happening out there on the ground with the sort of businesses that make up the business base.
Would Scottish Enterprise care to, the Scottish Government care to comment on that then?
I would support Mr Boland's actually saying. I think the caveat on that is the conduit of businesses that have actually been looked at, but also what type of finance they're actually seeking. There was figures within the SPICE paper, I can't seem to find them at the moment, but I think there's a fair number, something like 43% were looking for public sector finance, which is grants. So it's not bank finance was the prime focus of these businesses. So it's got to be taken into context with what these businesses were actually looking for, what type of support they were seeking.
Still makes me wonder then why financial and business services did so well. Are they getting more public money?
I couldn't answer that question because I'm not close enough to the account managed businesses.
Maybe we could ask, Colin Borden, are you aware, Colin, of differences between sectors? Has this come up from your members? Some sectors fare better than others?
At the moment, specifically in terms of access to finance, at the moment we don't analyse those figures by sector, and that's partly to do with sample size and getting reliable figures, but we very much hope to be able to do that with the work that we're doing across the UK with the Treasury. Generally, in terms of who's doing well at the moment and who's doing poorly, if you're in business helping other people do business more efficiently, so business consultancy services, computer services, that sort of thing, are performing strongly. If you're relying on discretionary consumer spend, obviously things are going to be tight. And I take Mr Robertson's point about tourism. There is, it's not a new problem that in Scotland we have a lot of tourist-related properties which require a lot of investment to get them up to the standard which the consumer in the TripAdvisor generation expects. I'm not sure there's a quick or easy answer to that, but it is a problem that we have identified and has been fed through to us from the ground.
Okay, Mark Meagher.
A question for the Scottish Government and perhaps SIB as well, just for perspective. The next panel that we'll be doing is looking mostly at alternative funding models, and since you're here for this one, I thought I might ask you at this stage. In particular, we've seen evidence, and you've clearly all read the SPICE briefings, that's helpful. We've seen evidence that crowdfunding is very small in Scotland, but that's understandable, it's relatively new, etc. But we've also seen some figures in there about business angels being proportionally much smaller in Scotland, potentially, in terms of their funding than UK as a whole. The figures given are 850 million per annum for the UK as an estimate and 22.5 million for Scotland per annum as an estimate, which is only about 3% of the UK figure. Based on your knowledge of access to finance and the policy situation, would you agree with that, and is the government addressing it?
I wouldn't agree with the figures. I think that when it comes to the business angel community in Scotland, I think we have got something in Scotland that we should be particularly proud. The business angel community has grown substantially since we first became involved in this area in 2003. We have something like 19 active business angel syndicates. There was a statistic that was out at the height of the banking crisis where the business angel market in the UK collapsed by 63%. In that particular year, the activity of the Scottish Investment Bank with its business angel partners doubled. So I think that there is a very proud story we have around the business angels. With some of the figures that appear at a national level, they are relevant to those angel syndicates that are members of the group collecting the data. and we have quite a high proportion of business angels syndicates in Scotland that are not members of these national organisations. So that's why the figures are skewed to be less than what they physically are. But,
so would you say then that that's actually a positive? There's a disproportionate strength in Scotland relative to the UK as a whole. And do you have, in any of your work, some counter statistics that you could perhaps provide to us later in writing that we could look at?
I could recommend an organisation called Link Scotland, who acts as a trade association for the business angel networks in Scotland, and they produce data on a regular basis. In fact, next month they're about to celebrate their 20th anniversary, but they have on their website on a yearly basis, they produce data on the business angel investment in Scotland.
The £22.5 million figure I quoted did come from them, but I would be interested to maybe get any further written submission on that, because if that is an area of disproportionate strength, that's something we'll want to reflect.
Right, we need to finish this session by 11, and I've got 3 members who want to come in with questions. I'll start with Hans Malik, seeing as he's not had an opportunity to ask anything so far.
Good morning and welcome from me. I seem to see that the banks are getting a bit of a hard time, and I think that's maybe unfair. I think that you quite clearly need to make a business case for any application that comes to you in the first place. However, what I would like to say is that maybe you could explore the possibility of working with Scottish Enterprise. We clearly have identified an area, particularly in tourism, where there is an issue. And whilst I appreciate that you need to make a financial case, I think Scottish Enterprise also has a responsibility to make sure that we try to encourage whatever businesses we have available in Scotland to flourish. Clearly, tourism is a strong area that we want to develop. Perhaps in partnership with them, we could come up with some sort of scheme, a pilot project of some sort, to try and support some of these industries so that we can see a better return in the future and help develop that industry. Would you be able to look into that for us?
A very good relationship with Scottish Enterprise. If we feel that there's a gap in the market, then it's incumbent upon us, as I've said earlier on this morning, to endeavour to fill it. So yes, we'll take that away as something that we should follow up on.
Thank you. Thank you.
I would just make one other point, that we've actually seconded one of our relationship directors into Highlands and Islands Enterprise for a year to explore this type of opportunity, to ensure that the relationship is stronger and we can support Scotland.
To sort of develop around women in business, and we've heard from earlier evidence that women are perhaps more debt averse in business. I would just wonder if the banks have a view on that. Do they think that women do actually avoid debt in business?
Can I explain what we are doing as an organisation to try and encourage women to start up in business? Because I think that's probably the root of this issue, as opposed to whether or not they want to borrow money. And that the root is, I believe, that not enough women are starting up in business. Now, through our Inspiring Enterprise programme, we have committed to helping 20,000, across the UK, 20,000 women start in business by the end of 2015. If we're successful in that, then we've got 20,000 more businesses than otherwise we might have had. And it's at that point in time that we can, that once they're established and once they've got the willingness to and ability to borrow, then we perhaps start to see some changes at that point in time. I don't have any statistics to give a sense as to whether or not they don't want to borrow, but we definitely have some statistics that not enough women are starting in business, and we're encouraging as many as we can to do that.
Mr. Gardner, do you have a view?
Again, I would echo Ken's comments. I unfortunately don't have any statistics on the specific question about women borrowing, women in business borrowing. Our focus is to support entrepreneurialism across all sectors, and part of what we're trying to do is to free up our frontline staff to spend as much time with entrepreneurs from whichever gender to grow their businesses.
I think we all recognise that we need to encourage more women into business, but is there anything more then that the government could do to encourage women into business?
From the government perspective, it's I mean, part of the entrepreneurial programme that we're running, we're keen to support women into enterprise. So we've been working with the Women in Enterprise organisation, giving them some funding to particularly promote role models, so they can kind of undertake work promoting women role models and also mentoring women going into business. But certainly, yeah, working with the banks on you know, for those figures for lending to women would be a good addition to that programme as well.
Just thinking on the responses from the two bankers, that they're not aware that women are averse to debt. Perhaps you should be looking into that to find out if, you know, that is the case, and that's why they're not coming back to you for loans. And I just wonder if you should be looking at that.
We certainly could do, but I think the important thing is that we encourage as many women to start up in business, and once they've got once the businesses are up and running, they've got the confidence to be able to approach the banks in the same way that start-up businesses for men require to have the confidence to approach the banks and have the confidence in their business plan. But yeah, it's something that we perhaps should have an answer to. But I think the important thing is that we encourage as many women as possible to start in business, and that's something that we're actively undertaking.
Let's ask Colin Boland on that question.
Yes, I mean, again, we do a lot of work with women in enterprise as well, trying to get more women to start up in business, because it can be, you know, an incredibly rewarding career. I'm not aware of any information that we have which specifically says if you compare like with like, that there is a particular gender-specific issue. But it's certainly something that we'll explore as we look at doing some of the broader work that I've spoken a bit about this morning.
Okay, thanks. It was, Professor Sarah Carter had given that evidence at an earlier session on another inquiry we were doing. So.
Okay, just time for one last question.
Yes, let me, one question. If I could up from the banks, it'd be interesting if we can see the proportion of mortgage lending to small business lending by region in the UK over the last 4 quarters. Do you think that would be possible? I know it must be there somewhere, but it'd be interesting just to see if we can get our hands on that. My second question is, although not necessarily agreeing with Patrick Harvey, I think participation of the community is very important, and particularly when we actually own part of the banks just now. I just wonder what your views would be on, at some stage in the future, having in a meaningful Scottish stock exchange, a form of AIM listing for small businesses.
Who would like to tackle that one?
It would be interesting to see where the equity demand for that would be, because clearly without an equity participation, one would see whether a stock exchange would fly or die. So it would be worthy of consideration, but I'd be interested to see who would put the equity into it.
Certainly generate competition.
The demand for companies who are listing on AIM is whilst the stock exchange itself is in London, the flows of capital come both from Scotland and from England. But yes, it would be interesting to see whether or not there was demand here to support such.
Amy, thank you.
I was going to say yes. I mean, it's an issue that has been discussed. The issue of regional stock exchanges has been discussed for some years. Like colleagues on the panel, I think it's definitely worthy of some sort of exploration. But what the demand might be, we haven't tested.
Okay, I think we need to call it a day at that. Can I thank all our panellists for their contribution? It's been very helpful to the committee to get your views. We will now have a short suspension to allow a changeover. We can reconvene. Thank you. We now have our second panel on the question of access to finance. Now, I should say we're supposed to have 5 on this panel, and sadly we have lost 3 members of the panel due to illness and 1 due to unexpected business commitment. So I'm especially grateful to Neil Simpson, who's the Finance Director of Brewdog, and Tim Wright from Twin Tangibles for coming along. And I'm sorry you're feeling rather lonely this morning. That's just the way things have worked out. Before we get into questions, I wonder if you would both like to say a little bit, just by way of introduction, a little bit about your experience in terms of funding. Mr Simpson, do you want to start?
Yeah. Brewdog started 2007, and since then we've, grown at quite a pace and explored conventional and maybe not so conventional alternative funding options. So we started very small in Fraser in 2007 with the 2 owners and their own funds, a little bit of bank support. So the conventional route was explored first. But I guess from 2007, 2008, it hit that problematic time in the conventional market, if that's the right way to explain it. And so they had to look for different ways. And for Brewdog, crowdfunding satisfied 2 routes. It provided that extra funding that maybe the conventional funding routes was not able to do. But secondly, it allowed us that engagement with our customer base and the people that are interested. And I think for us, that's equally as important and valuable to us as a business as the money itself. And I think that's where the crowdfunding has worked particularly well, that engagement factor with the investors. So we started back in 2010 and did that ourselves, as Tim was explaining to me, DIY crowdfunding, if you like, our own platform through our own website, and learned a lot from that first round. It didn't achieve the goals it was set out to do, and didn't raise the maximum amount that we were hoping to raise, but gave valuable lessons for the business growing forward. As a result, the business growing again needed more funds, and in 2011 we did a second funding round, but on this occasion it was fully funded, subscribed and closed early, and that gave us just over £2 million for capital development and growth of the business, and got us to just over 6,000 investors in our business. At that point, they are owning just under 10% of our business, so it's not a significant part, but it is a reasonable amount of equity I've given away. But given the success of that round, and again the growth that we're experiencing, almost 100% year on year, we need more money, and we went back this year for a 3rd round, currently in the press, I'm sure you've seen it, and at present we're at 90% of that offering, and the total we're requesting this time round is 4.2 million. So it looks like we will be, touch wood, very disappointed if we don't maximise that this year. And that will take us up to about 13.5% of the equity away. And I think the development of our business has gone hand in hand with the success of crowdfunding. So in the early stages, as I said, of the business, the public awareness of the brand and Brewdog was not so strong. As that awareness and brand has developed, I think the success of crowdfunding has been far easier to achieve. It's not without hard work, but it's certainly been a far more successful avenue for us, given the awareness in the market of Brewdog and what we're trying to do. We don't do things by convention. We're not necessarily doing everything as per the textbooks, but that's what Brewdog is. We try to do things a little bit different, and to date it seems to be working, and long may that continue.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wright.
Yes, I'm Tim Wright, Director of Twin Tangibles. We're a Scottish registered Anglo-Italian consultancy firm. We specialise in the impact of disruptive and collaborative technologies and the opportunities that presents for business. That takes us into crowdsourcing, open innovation, and of course crowdfunding. We are internationally recognised as experts in crowdfunding. We've acted as advisors to the OECD, the Consob in Italy. We've advised Scottish Enterprise and other organisations. We ran some of the first events in Scotland on crowdfunding and crowdsourcing. And earlier this year, we were commissioned by the Glasgow Chamber of Commerce to undertake a review of crowdfunding in Scotland, which was published in June of this year. I think you've got a copy of that report made available to you, which highlighted a potential missed opportunity in Scotland and a lower level of take-up than we perhaps anticipated.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll want to tease out in the course of the session some of the issues around that. Maybe just start off, Mr. Simpson, with yourself, just maybe so we understand a little bit better about your business experience. The equity investors who've come in very successfully and supported the business expansion, have these in the main been customers of the business?
A large number of them are customers, but given that there's now 12,000 of them, at this point we're not aware as to how much of them, indeed are buying the product. And I think as we've gone through the equity rounds, we're seeing more and more people investing larger amounts of money, which to me means they're probably, looking at this far more as an investment proposition as opposed to getting involved with us as a brand and the engagement with us as a brand. So I think there is a mix of both, but I would be very surprised if the majority of our shareholders aren't customers, given the reward benefits we give them with their shareholding.
That's what I'm going on to. So people who buy the equity are not just getting a stake in the business, but there are other benefits they get along with that.
That's correct. They receive a discount in our bars when they're in our bars, and they also receive a discount for any purchases they make on the online shop. So there's that benefit. If you like the product, you can weigh up your return on that over a period. But equally, there's the benefits that they get prior notice to any releases of new products. They get invited to our AGM, which is not quite, again, a conventional AGM. It's slightly more entertaining, shall we say, with the refreshments on offer and the entertainment. And they also, get asked. We've got a forum within our social media that they communicate with us on a regular basis, and they give us their comments and we feed back to them. So there is that real engagement with us, and we take very seriously communicating back with them and keeping them involved with what we're doing.
And how was the investment opportunity marketed? Was that done by yourselves? Was it done through social media? Did you go out to traditional investment houses, for example?
No, like I say, it's a DIY setup, so we've obviously got the share offer documents certified by approved financial services organisation, and from that we then list it on our website and promote it through our social media. So between our many Twitter, Facebook accounts that we have and the following that is there, we've just generated the media there. Additionally, we've had very good PR, which have managed to make sure that the press have picked up on our activities quite on a regular basis, which has meant good coverage of what we're trying to do and giving good public exposure to it.
Thank you. A number of members want to come in with questions, so we'll just start with Marco Biaggi.
Thank you. The first question is a general one about the methods of crowdfunding. How much can it be expanded? Could it ever become central? Because the figures I've seen show that it's 1,000 times smaller in monthly volume at the moment than conventional lending. Is this always going to be something that's a niche?
Its growth rate from obviously a recent and low start is extremely fast. There was an 80% uplift year on year from 2011 to 2012. This year, the anticipated sums raised globally are $5.4 billion US dollars, which is admittedly a modest sum, but if the growth rate continues as it has done in recent years, then it could become a significant sum. The World Bank have just produced a report on the potential for crowdfunding into developing world, and looking at that in billions of dollars per year as a potential investment into the developing world. So the scale is large. Nesta are suggesting that on a 3-year timeline there's a £14.5 billion investment potential from crowdfunding within the UK. But I think we have to see crowdfunding as being part of the financial mix. It's not going to replace things. It will just become an established part of the mix. And it's a question of how it fits in with the other investment models and where it fits in. And I think as the quantum and the size of the funds available grow, it will be able to fit into more areas and at different points in a business lifespan than perhaps it is typically imagined that it will at the moment.
It's important to remember that in the pre-crash days, the figures we have is that the net lending, not even gross lending from banks, was at 150 billion a year to small businesses. So clearly there's a scale there. Mr. Simpson, how different in practice was what you did from an IPO of shares, other than that you didn't do it on a stock market?
In terms of giving away equity in the business, there's not any real difference there at all from the IPO, but the reward factor linking to that and the engagement, I think, does differentiate it, and that, for me, is where, in Tim's comment there, I would say that there is probably a scalability to crowdfunding. It would be my view that if you are offering shares to the public in this way or other rewards in this way to the public, it must, in my view, be something that they can recognise the product, they can understand the business before they would be able to make that investment in it. And therefore crowdfunding probably is, on a small scale, will work very well, but when you're wanting to take it to much bigger numbers, I think my view would be you've got to have a brand or a product that the public would be able to relate to.
And for that, your PR has clearly been rather outstanding in your sector and in terms of being able to command media attention. I mean, how replicable is that for other companies? Because it's hard to imagine another BrewDog coming along and making the same waves that you have, because you've already done it. To your credit, as a business.
I was waiting to say, did I say I hope there isn't another BrewDog come along, but we would welcome another, member in the market coming along and trying, to do the same thing. And I think there's been things in the market that there are one or two other breweries looking into doing some sort of crowdfunding share offer as well on the back of our success. So I think the social media, undoubtedly, we would not have reached half of what we reached without it. And whether we all like it or not, that is where more and more business is being done. And more people will be looking at social media as opposed to the traditional press. And so if you are going to be successful, whether it be in promoting your brand or raising finance, you have to really promote it really hard on the social media networks.
The last question I have is, I associate crowdfunding, or before I was going through this, I associated crowdfunding with the likes of Kickstarter, the very, very early stage work. What's the scalability of that particular area? I should add, it's an area of crowdfunding I have myself participated in and donating to something and getting something back. Is that something that's going to be a major?
It already is. Perhaps we should explain that there are four fundamental models in crowdfunding. There's the equity-based model, which BrewDog exemplify. The reward-based model, which Kickstarter is, where people receive some kind of tangible or intangible reward, product or service in return for a pledge. There's the peer-to-peer debt-based model, where loans are met through a crowd. And there is also the donation-based model, which most of us will be familiar with through Just Giving and those types of platforms. In the largest part of crowdfunding at the moment is the peer-to-peer model, the loan-based model. But the equity side is growing quite rapidly, and the size of the deals that tend to be larger in the equity-based model than they are typically in a reward-based model. But there's always exceptions that make the rule. So if we were to look at the reward-based model, the world record crowdfunding project is another DIY model, but it was a reward-based model, and it's raised to date $23 million for a single firm. So these things are scalable. In Scotland, on Kickstarter, RunRev raised £493,000 recently, an Edinburgh-based firm. So, the different models suit different businesses with different skills, attributes, and positioning. So it's a very, very broad spectrum. But is it scalable? Undoubtedly, yes. I think we'll find more and more organisations recognise that they have crowd-based assets that they can leverage to generate funds for them. BrewDog is a real exemplar in the way that they've carried this through in many things that they've achieved. But other brands will do that. And it's not particularly limited to a particular sector. But if the key thing to understand, I think, about crowdfunding is it's the notion that it's new capital flowing into the market. The idea of crowdfunding is to bring people that have not directly participated in investment before into the marketplace. It's the empowerment that social technologies provide. Consequently, these are new inflows of capital that will sit alongside the existing capital markets. And there are some well-known estimates. People have produced estimates that if 1% of the United States long-term investments that are tied up by personal investments were released, that's $23 trillion worth of investment that could actually go directly into the capital markets. The difference being it would be directly invested by individuals who are looking at that as, if you will, a retail investment that's otherwise not available to them. So it is undoubtedly scalable.
Off the wall thought that I've just had, could there be applications to public sector funding?
There already are. There are, for example, civic crowdfunding campaigns which are specifically designed at civic projects, these construction projects, for example, and there are also lots of opportunities for co-investment. So we can see examples of things like the West of Scotland Loan Fund, which is predominantly drawn from public sector funding, are now quite happy to co-invest alongside crowdfunding money. They will only ever meet 50% of a particular loan, but they would be entirely comfortable with taking 50% of a loan that is otherwise backed through crowdfunding sources. And I think civic engagement in crowdfunding, particularly in governmental engagement in crowdfunding, is particularly at the moment on the peer-to-peer platform. So we're conscious of the money from the UK government that's gone on to Funding Circle and Zopa through the Business Funding Partnership. That is always co-investment. Lancashire County Council have done essentially the same thing. They will only take up a maximum of 20% of any individual loan. So the bulk of the loan is met by the rest of the market. And so they're leveraging what funds they have got very effectively by co-investing. So I think it has significant opportunities for civic bodies to actually use their money effectively, but also bind things in very, very closely with the community by investing alongside them.
Let's go back to I think it was Marco Biaggi's second question about the types of businesses attracting crowdfunding. I mean, I can see why a customer-facing brand like BrewDog would find it not easy, but the obvious customer base they can tap into. Somebody who's a widget maker might find it a lot harder. Is that fair?
That's entirely fair, and you would probably, each business will look at the options that are available to them. So, for example, in that case, they may wish to take some debt-based funding through a peer-to-peer platform. And depending what the individual businesses can bring to a crowdfunding situation will determine the path down which they might go. We typically would take an organisation through a four-stage process to decide what was the best option for them. And it may well be that crowdfunding might not suit them. It's not for everybody. And in the case of things like the equity rounds, the public equity rounds, and the reward-based models that were referred to as RunRev, these things are tremendously demanding. This is not an easy thing for organisations to do. They take tremendous amounts of effort, resource and preparation. But they are an alternative which otherwise many feel is not available to them. So that's why they choose it.
Thank you. Just a question about platforms. It may be that when BrewDog started this journey, there weren't a lot of platforms ready built out there, and that's why you decided to go with a kind of slightly homebrew version, if you see what I mean. Would you have, if you were starting this now, would you have gone with a commercially available platform that's out there, or is there actually an additional value in inculcating that customer loyalty and fanhood by making the experience of participating in it one that is entirely controlled through your own brand and your own kind of corporate identity and so on?
Probably if we were to start again now, we would be exploring those platforms in more detail. Back when we did the first round, the models, as you say, were not so widely available, and indeed the costs of doing this, we found that our cost base on our first round was proportionately much higher than it has been this time. So the experience we've gained from doing it, and as the market has moved on, and as probably as our business has moved on, they're maybe looking at our model from a risk assessment, financial services, all that sort of thing. But the costs were far higher doing it first time to now. But they were still significantly less doing it ourselves in round one than they would have been going through a platform. And again, like for us, that engagement, that having control of the whole process on your own branding, on your own website, rather than doing it through a platform, so it's on a platform with your branding, it gives you that direct connection with the investor, and I think that's been very, very good for us.
But how it fits with other sources of finance. You've said that it's one element alongside others. Are you able to put a figure on the additional value that this kind of investment has because of the customer loyalty, because of the sense of building a relationship with your customers and people who, you know, identify with the brand in that way? Does it have additional commercial value to you compared with other sources of finance?
Certainly. I mean, we can't at this point, but if we continue to manage this in the right way through our engagement with the investors, we see this as 12,000 sales reps on the road for our brand. They've got a vested interest in the success of what we're doing. They like the product and that engagement. So there's that commercial benefit there as well. That aside, you look at the costs, because we have bank debt as well as asset finance debt. We've had excellent support in the grant market as well. So we've looked at, you know, we've tapped into pretty much all the markets of conventional and this crowdfunding route. All have value, and I guess the crowdfunding one, it's far more difficult to pinpoint that value, because obviously we can quantify the rewards we're giving away. That's very easy, but the intangible bits about brand development and where they help to promote that, it's not that easy to manage and quantify.
And just briefly, if I could ask Mr. Wright if he could comment as well on this issue about platforms and how much control a company wants to try and retain over the experience that a crowdsourcing investment participant would have. You know, does that platform still need to be controlled in order to maximise the real value it's got?
The fundamental proposition of platforms is that they actually drive down the incremental cost of every transaction. And if you imagine in a crowdfunding environment, you're looking to aggregate together a large number of very, very small investments. And consequently, making the transactional cost of each of those investments very, very low is important, because if you didn't do that, then crowdfunding becomes unsustainable. And that's the main proposition of the platforms. They'll also see them themselves as points around which potential investors will coalesce. So the discoverability, if you will, of a investment opportunity through browsing and serendipitous discovery by people happening to be on a site with multiple projects on offer is another point that they will certainly emphasize. But what we're beginning to see is the emergence of a trend towards what we refer to as DIY crowdfunding. So these are organisations that are choosing to run their own crowdfunding campaign in the same way that Brewdog did. And their motivations for this are many and various. In some cases, they are follow-on campaigns. So they've already run a campaign on a platform. They have an established asset that they can draw on there in terms of a connection with a community of investors, and they wish to move that on to the next stage and avoid the costs associated, because there are costs going onto a platform, albeit quite low ones. And so they run it themselves. And also the flexibility is an important aspect. Platforms, to give you an idea, there are around 900 different platforms in the world available, and that you know, in the time it's taken me to tell you that, there's probably 901. So it's rapidly growing and will continue to do that. But some of the larger platforms, the more well-known ones like Kickstarter that we referred to, they put quite strong conditions around what they will permit and what they won't permit on the platform. For obvious reasons, and I think that will probably grow considerably over time, just as a risk mitigation factor for the platform. But the desire to actually run the campaign in your own way, offering the rewards that you want over a time frame that you want, is an attraction for some crowdfunders. So the trend towards the DIY model is certainly growing, and I think we'll probably see some larger and established brands using their brand presence through DIY crowdfunding for specific projects or possibly for corporate social responsibility ideas. And some are already sort of putting their toe in the water, if you will, about how they engage with crowdfunding.
Chip Brody.
Good morning. Mr Simpson, we're not allowed to physically applaud in the committee, but I think you deserve great applause for what you've done with your company. We've heard what you've done, when you did it, we know where you did it, and you partially answered the why when you answered Patrick Harvey's question, and you mentioned costs. But was there any other motivation? I mean, what is your view of the accessibility of finance and the approach of those who provide finance to small businesses in Scotland? Was that part of your motivation?
Yes, I mean, because from the pre-crash times to now, the financial model of the banks, as I guess you've just heard in the previous panel, has changed, and there is a far tighter approach to that risk from the financial institutions. So as a result, any capital projects you're looking for are capped at a certain percentage from conventional rounds of funding, and working capital funding when you're, I think, in an early start business is really quite difficult to access. And we are seeing probably a bit with the financial market as well, having developed and moved on, and maybe that tightening off being relaxed a little bit. We are seeing, good support from our bank. I mean, we can't, really fault them from where we are now in the support we're getting, but that's been a continual process of working closely with them, and them, I think, recognising now that as we're establishing ourselves, there's a more credible and a more viable investment opportunity for them. So,
it's true to say part of your motivation was difficulty in terms of the access to finance initially?
Well, difficulty, but also for speed of growth. Our model is we don't do something in 2 years if we can do it in 2 months. So, the speed that we wish to grow our business, the conventional models don't allow that to happen, because you've got to have your model working and your cash flow, etc., to make that happen. So we had to access other routes of finance to allow the speed of our growth to continue.
Yeah. Mr. Wright, I wonder if you had, I think, the previous session when we talked about professional advice, giving relationship managers who are business experienced people after 4 days a year training. In some of the blurb that we got in terms of what you were trying to do, one of the indications was the lack of professional advice in Scotland, financial advice. I mean, is it financial advice or business advice? I mean, what is the problem? I mean, because we hear there's a proliferation, well, there are no accountants listening, proliferation of financial advice. What's the situation in your view of overall business advice? We've heard about, you know, what good sales and marketing and PR does. Is it just lack of professional financial advice?
Well, I think in the reports that we produce, we certainly looked at some of the evidence that came up in the Breeden report, which suggested that poorly prepared financial statements were impairing business access to finance because they weren't able to make their case effectively or present their case effectively. We spoke to a number of the crowdfunding platforms who said that this was an issue for them, that sometimes organisations were trying to come onto an equity-based platform or a lending-based platform and didn't have sufficiently well-prepared financial statements. I don't know about the general availability of business advice to across the piece, if you will. I would suggest that there's perhaps a lack of expertise available on crowdfunding across the UK. There are one or two organisations like ourselves that can offer it, but that it's not commonly available. And we felt that the lack of understanding of the opportunity available through crowdfunding was something that was inhibiting the uptake. But in the generality of business advice that's available, I'm not sure that I'm really in a position to make a comment on that.
I wonder if I can move on in terms of the financial or the regulatory underpinning of crowdfunding. I mean, I know P2P and equity-based models are fairly well regulated. What about any of the other platforms?
From a regulatory point of view, the UK has had an extremely vibrant crowdfunding sector, largely because it hasn't specifically legislated for it up to now. The reward-based and donation-based platforms are not actively regulated. They don't fall under any particular regulations. Peer-to-peer still does not actually fall under any specific regulations. That part of the industry have lobbied to come under FCA regulations, which will be put in place from April of next year. The FCA have also published recommendations for a specific regulation to the equity-based model. There's a consultation document that's out at the moment from the FCA. There is a common misconception that equity-based crowdfunding is not regulated. It is regulated. It's very heavily regulated, as all investment models are. What's distinctive about the approach within the UK is that we have a common law system which has allowed the platforms to find a way to satisfy the regulatory requirements to actually operate to now. So in the case of Brewdog, where there's the DIY option, they have used FCA authorised bodies to undertake the regulated parts of what they're doing. The two most well-known equity-based platforms in the UK are Seedrs and Crowdcube, both of whom are formally FCA regulated. So the regulatory framework is there. What's being proposed is a kind of retrospective approach, which, if I may, I would say that is completely ridiculous, what's being proposed by the FCA, and is likely to be seriously detrimental to the equity-based platforms and the growth of equity-based crowdfunding in the UK. And it's deeply ironic to me that you've got other countries around the world desperately trying to enable crowdfunding by bringing in specific legislation to permit it. So we've had legislation in Italy. There's ongoing debate in the USA how the SEC are going to finally permit the Jobs Act and limit it.
This is concentrated in Scotland because there's a platform that you had my question earlier about AIM listing.
Yes.
And in a more meaningful Scottish Stock Exchange. You have a platform coming down the pike called Sharon, which is, I don't know, is that effectively the same thing in terms of a soon-to-launch Scottish-based equity platform?
There are two.
That, to me, is a pseudo-AIM listing type vehicle.
Well, what's interesting about equity-based platforms at the moment is that all of the assets that are generated, and BrewDog are in this case as well, they are non-tradable assets, so they're illiquid, and there is no secondary market for them. We have had numerous discussions with bodies about the potential for introducing a secondary market for these equities, and I think there will be a large opportunity there for some body and some jurisdiction to set themselves up as the place at which this secondary market takes place. The advantage of having the secondary market is that it brings more liquidity, it brings confidence, and it allows people to actually realise their assets and trade them. And it underpins the peer-to-peer lending market, where there is almost always a secondary market. So, for example, if I were to go onto a platform like Funding Circle, buy £100 worth of a loan going to a business and then want to liquidate that, I can trade that on the secondary market on the platform. So the two platforms that exist in Scotland, the equity-based platforms ShareIn and Square Not, will be in exactly the same position of all of the other equity platforms in the UK, in that the assets that they generate are non-tradable. We have spoken to... Sorry? At this stage, yes. And there are significant problems associated with it, because there are a variety of different types of share that is created, some of them specifically non-transferable. But there are ways around this, and we have advocated the setting up of a European secondary market for all of the European equity platforms to be able to trade their assets on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Margaret McDougall.
Crowdfunding. You mentioned earlier how successful it has been, and it's increased greatly across the world. But in Scotland, there has been less of an uptake in that. Could you perhaps give your views on why you think that is, and why it's not so popular in Scotland?
Certainly. The report that we produced earlier on for this year for the Glasgow Chamber of Commerce was intended to have a look at crowdfunding in Scotland, the general levels of interest and awareness as much as anything else, and its fit with the financial needs of business in Scotland. But it became apparent through the course of doing the research, which was both quantitative in that we had survey-based material and undertook more than 50 interviews with a whole range of bodies that are involved with either directly or tangentially with crowdfunding. It became apparent very early on that the level of uptake in Scotland was quite low. So whilst it wasn't the specific aim of the research to actually explain that, we did at least try and ask for reasons that were for why that might be the case. And there were a number of things suggested to us. And I think that if you have a look at the report, there are a number of things suggested. One was a lack of Scottish platforms, specific aversion to debt-based finance, a lower need for finance in Scotland. All of these various things were put forward. None of them, as far as we could tell, actually held water. There was nothing distinctive in Scotland that actually suggested these were the reasons for it. So we could only come to the view that it was a general lack of awareness that was driving this. Because we were able to point to examples of successful equity funds in other parts of the UK and within Wales and outside of the M25, as you would expect the majority of the activity to be. But we weren't able to identify those same examples in Scotland. And it's something of a conundrum and worthy of further research. But I think the fact that you're having this session today, the fact that organisations like the Chamber of Commerce actually decided to actually undertake the research, means that there is a growing level of interest, and I think that needs to be nurtured and encouraged. And when you have such a tremendous example as BrewDog in Scotland, it seems peculiar that it's not more embedded in the ways that Scottish businesses look for finance.
Do you think the likes of Scottish Enterprise and maybe Business Gateway, what are their levels of awareness like? Are they telling businesses about this?
I think it's fair to say that we found the general level of awareness and understanding of crowdfunding across the institutions that we spoke to was relatively low. And in almost all cases, their awareness of it had been driven by a bottom-up approach, in that their clients, their contacts, had actually come to them and said, what's this thing, crowdfunding? What do we need to do about it? And that was actually driving them to get some engagement with it and some further understanding. But I think it's fair to say that most of those institutions could certainly benefit from getting a more sophisticated understanding of the opportunity, yes.
Just ask one other question to Mr Simpson. Obviously you have other funding methods in there. The reaction of banks to your share funding, has that been favourable, or are they a bit feel it's risky, or?
It's been very positive, actually, because the benefits of this share generation for us means that our company balance sheet net worth is strengthened considerably. So when the banks are lending, they're looking at that equity-based balance to what your debt funding is, and so they're looking at our crowdfunding on a very positive point of view as opposed to a negative.
Now, but earlier on when you were starting out?
At that time we were with a different bank, and I guess in all sectors at that point, the model wasn't proven, and the values involved at that time that we were dealing with were far smaller, so it didn't have the same connection. But certainly we've had no negative response from our banks to doing this.
So, Mr Wright, would that be a message that you would convey to banks, that they should be encouraging this?
Well, it's an interesting point in that in the process of doing this particular piece of research in Scotland, we spoke to a number of banks, all of the main banks effectively, to ask them about their attitude and awareness to crowdfunding. And they all told us that they are open for business and ready to lend, and they encourage other entrants to the market, etc., as you might expect. But they also made the point that, of course, they will have to turn down certain applicants to them, and that they're interested in crowdfunding as being a potential alternative. Now, we ran a scenario on every single bank which said, OK, I'm going to take you at your word, and you have turned a small business down for a loan, and you've advised them to go and look at crowdfunding, and they have gone and looked at crowdfunding, and they have managed to generate £100,000 through pre-sales for this product that they wanted to take to market. And they come back to you and say, isn't this terrific? Would that change your view of the business? And they said, absolutely, it would change our view, and we would potentially reconsider whether we would actually loan to them, how we would respond to them. And that's what one would expect. But I think it demonstrates the value, if you will, of crowd validation of business models, and it also demonstrates that in many respects the banks have de-skilled themselves in their ability to judge risk particularly well. And for organisations to be able to draw on the validation of their business idea through the crowd is quite a useful asset for them to have.
I'm just thinking about crowdfunding. You've gone for your second equity. Is there a limit? Where would the maximum be on crowdfunding in a business? Because obviously, you don't want to sell off the silver, basically, and you want to keep a hold of as much shares as you can. So, where does crowdfunding stop, basically?
Good question. Brewdog next week. Well, who knows? But it's a business by business decision, and it will depend on where each business is at any point in time, as it is with any equity investment, as to how much you're prepared to give away. Just now, Tim might correct me here, but as I understand it, the legislation in Europe says that on an annual basis you can only do €5 million of fundraising through crowdfunding in any one calendar year. So I guess at the moment that puts the cap on what you can do through that platform. Pardon?
buy a distillery with that, could you not?
Well, you could buy half our brewery with that. So,
there are plenty of examples now of people that are going through first, second, and third rounds of funding through the equity-based models. For the other types of crowdfunding, obviously, for a reward-based model, and the model that I referred to, the world record, the $23 million US, is a reward-based model, and so they just continually iterate. And in some cases, this really suits some types of business. So games and software developers can go through an iterative development path, each of which is funded by a separate crowd-funded round. But one of it slightly speaks to a point that was made by one of the two gentlemen over here earlier on. It's where crowdfunding fits into the financial mix. Speaking to the Link Angel body, some of their concerns with crowdfunding were they felt that many of the equity-based platforms were overvaluing the offers that were made, but what they are short of are exits. So I suggested, well, how about crowdfunding as an exit for you? And if you think they're overvalued, that's surely a perfect fit. And I think as the size of crowdfunding deals increases, that where crowdfunding fits into a finance model, it will change. And we typically think of it at the moment as being entrepreneurial and startup, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that. It can fit at different points.
Thank you.
Just before I bring in Dennis Robertson, I want to go back to a question, Margaret, we took a moment ago about Scottish Enterprise and Business Gateway. Maybe, Mr Simpson, can you tell us what support you've had as a company from Business Gateway or Scottish Enterprise?
Scottish Enterprise have been very supportive to BrewDog over the years prior to the crowdfunding. So on an annual basis, we get excellent support for our export because we do export quite a considerable amount of our business, and also our employees and increasing our staff numbers. So we have an excellent support, and there's more traditional Scottish Enterprise funding avenues. And I think I would echo Tim's comment there that it's with us taking our crowdfunding on this third round to Scottish Enterprise, they have given us some support in the costs of meeting bringing the offering to market. So they are there, but it was more a case of us going to them as opposed to them coming to us.
So you think they've now kind of caught up with what's happening?
I think there's an awareness there, but I think in not just that avenue, but in a lot of avenues, business has to go asking the question for a lot of support as opposed to it being made directly available or openly available to them. So it's an awareness thing from a business perspective.
Have you had any engagement with Business Gateway?
No, we've been all through Scottish Enterprise.
Through Scottish Enterprise.
Yeah.
And are you an account managed company?
We are.
You are. Okay, thank you. Okay, Dennis Robertson.
It's really to Mr Simpson, and obviously just to echo the words that others have said. You've got an extremely successful business there. I'm not, I wouldn't like to say if it's the product or the marketing as to how successful you've been. But in terms of future finance, do you see yourself in terms of the future using much more conventional routes in terms of either probably the bank in terms of a lending? I mean, you've partly answered the question earlier, but do you see yourself going down the route of more conventional borrowing to expand rather than sort of being reliant on the crowdfunding?
That would depend on where the growth happens to be. I think, as I said earlier, I think our credibility in the market as we grow and we deliver what we said we would do in future fundraisings is delivered, then we would use the conventional funding. But again, even now, they are limited in their uses within the business. So again, they're capped at certain levels. So the next BrewDog adventure may be slightly more risky for a conventional funding route, in which case we would have to keep the alternative market as a possible source for us. But so,
this morning from the banks, their door is open for business. And,
yes, and like I say, I would say that we are getting excellent support from the bank in terms of the cost of the finance they're providing to us, but the limits that are placed on that mean that you, in any capital project, have to fund a certain percentage yourself. So if you don't have that readily available, you have to look at the alternatives to raise that funds.
Am I right in thinking that you brought crowdfunding to Scottish Enterprise rather than the Scottish Enterprise bringing it to you as an option?
That's correct.
Don't you really think, in some respects, it should have been the other way around?
Yes, indeed. I think given the difficulties that business have in raising finance, then the support that we can get from the public bodies will make that far easier. It is that awareness thing that I think has meant that, as a few of you have said, crowdfunding hasn't been taken up so much in Scotland.
And you see crowdfunding as an opportunity for entrepreneurs, maybe in the start-up, in a sense, getting themselves established? Because it looks as if the banks are saying, once you're established and once you've have a proven track record, then they're more interested. Rather than the bank saying, actually, you know something, we maybe just take a risk on you.
Your previous panel may well have said what their lending criteria are, but my experience so far is that if you've got a nice bit of bricks and mortar, that's a nice decision to make. But if it's looking at a business venture, launching a new product or launching into a new market, you've no evidence to prove your success in that, and therefore, even if you have got a good track record, that's not such an easy way to raise bank funding.
Thank you very much for that. I think you've probably clarified some of the questions that maybe weren't explored or weren't clearly defined maybe in the earlier session. Thank you.
Okay. Briefly, Chick Ronnie.
Yeah, just in your opinion, I wish to put you on the spot, Mr Simpson, but I'm about to. Does that mean, you answered the last question, does that mean, because it's easier for them to understand properly, that the people who are giving advice from the banks and the credit people, they don't really understand business at all, do they?
My own experience of our own bank has been excellent. They understand our business really well, and we have an excellent relationship with them. Well, but yeah, I mean, I think they have to get to know business. It's any service, whether it be public bodies, whether it be your accountants, your lawyers, your bank. They need to understand your business to be able to give you the right advice.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay. I think that's it. Thank you both very much for coming along. It's been a very, very interesting session and has given the committee an insight into crowdfunding that we wouldn't otherwise have had. So I'm grateful to you for giving up your time and coming along. We'll have a very brief suspension to allow the witnesses to leave.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right, okay, if we can reconvene. Item 4 on the agenda, subordinate legislation. We have a negative instrument to consider, the electricity generating stations, bracket, applications for variation of consent, close bracket, bracket, Scotland, close bracket, regulations 2013, SSI 2013/304. This has been brought to committee. It's been to the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, who have no points to make on it. Do any members have any issues they want to raise in relation to this? Patrick.
Thanks, Convener. I think the general purpose, the general intention of allowing variation, allowing application for variation of consents makes complete sense, and I suspect that there'll be pretty unanimous agreement on that. I do think some of the issues which have been raised about the detail do give me reason for concern, and particularly the fact that we're being asked to approve this, as far as I'm aware, before we've seen the guidance that the Scottish Government intends to produce. I think it would be far better if we were in a position to be able to look at least at draft guidance to see whether and to what extent the concerns which have been raised, particularly around the scope of what would be considered a variation as opposed to a new application for consent. If we could at least see the draft guidance, we would know whether these concerns have been addressed properly and understood by ministers. So I would prefer that we expressed that view and said that we should see the guidance, at least in draft form, before the committee or the Parliament is asked to agree to the instrument.
Okay, I mean, in terms of timing, we have to consider this by the 2nd of December. So we have a small amount of time in hand if we did want to follow something up. But I'd be interested to hear views of any other members if they share Patrick's concern or not.
I think, Patrick, I mean, I agree with the sentiment. I'm not so sure that the concerns are so significant as to warrant any great delay. I think the more urgent concern here is that we know from Ofgem that UK generating capacity is down to a reserve capacity of about 2%. That's very, very close to, to the point where the lights go out. And given that, and given the fact that, I think it would be incredible for the government to give assurances that it's had already given that this is not about substantive redrafts of, applications or whatever. It's about relatively minor things that are really non-material, with some safeguards that local planning authorities will still have an input into the process and so on. I'm not convinced that it's, I hear the in principle objection, but I'm not convinced that in reality it's tangible enough to really suggest that we should send it back to government to think again or await the full development of the guidance. Given also, I think we've only heard from RSPB, and from nobody else. So you can, I think, safely assume there's not huge and widespread concern about this.
I don't think it's unreasonable to look at a draft, particularly since we do have the time. I mean, I don't really see what the issue is. I'm quite happy for it to come back after having a look at a draft.
I should clarify. I mean, there isn't a draft to look at. I mean, I think the options open to us today are either just to say we have no concerns, or alternatively to say we could write to the Scottish Government and ask them for more information in relation to the draft guidance and bring it back on the agenda next week, if that's something that was of interest to members. That's a decision we'll have to make. But I think there will not be draft guidance to look at before we approve or otherwise this instrument, because it's just not going to be available.
And the consultation sought clarification. Do we know what these points were that they were looking for clarification on?
No, I'm not aware of what the detail of the points raised by any of the stakeholders with the Scottish Government are. And certainly, if the committee is minded to ask, I'm certainly try to find out some of that detail to you if that's something that the committee wants to do.
I frankly, I agree with Mike. I don't see the purpose of bringing this back, given, and I won't rehearse all the arguments that have already been disposed. I don't know what value would add to that and whether we'd arrive at a totally different situation.
Any other views, Dennis?
Yeah, I think one of the things is, I think I mean, I tend to go along to it. I'm not sure that why we want to bring it back, so I'm not quite sure we'll get much more information that will give any more clarity than we have. But I think for future things, I think it's well worth asking the government to try and provide as much information as possible regarding, and if there's no guidance, there is no guidance. But you know, if there is a lack of information around certain instruments, then you know it's probably incumbent of them to try and produce that before we do make the decisions. But I'm not sure in terms of this one that there's really any point in delaying it, to be honest.
Any other views?
It is an important issue. The fact that we do have the time, the fact that we could get more clarity, I think it simply allows the opportunity. There may not be any change at the end of it, that's fine as well, but I think the fact that we have that possibility and that opportunity, I think we should avail it. We should be irresponsible and not avail it. I think it's just height of irresponsibility if we don't want to take that opportunity.
Any other views? Well, I mean, there's a spread of opinions on this. I mean, we're not under time pressure to do it. My own feeling on this is, if members have some concerns about this, it makes sense to ask some questions and bring it back next week. But I mean, that would be my sense of what we do.
On that basis, Convener, can I ask then that the members' concerns are expressed more specifically? So I would invite Hanzala to say specifically what is it that he's specifically concerned may happen in the real world as a result of us, you know, just passing this now, as it were. What are your real concerns? And if you could, because I think if we ask specific questions of the government, more likely to get useful answers.
Well, I mean, to be fair, Mr Mackenzie, you know, the number of representations have been made. We don't have details of them before us. Maybe it would be helpful to the committee actually if we got some more clarification on what the issues are that those making representation have raised, and we can then put that in a letter to the relevant minister and ask for a detailed response. Patrick?
Yeah, I think all members should have received RSPB's briefing, which does set out in detail their concerns around issues, for example, about the definition of variation, what would require an application for variation and what would need to be dealt with as a completely new application for consent, as well as issues around the role of public inquiries and local planning authorities. There's also some variations, some differences between what's been done here and what's been done south of the border in terms of ministers' responsibility to take into account the views of those that they have already consulted. I think it's perfectly reasonable to ask the government to respond to those concerns. Whether they're able to publish draft guidance or not, I think it would be helpful if they could, but even if they can't, I find it hard to believe that the lights are going to go out if we leave this a week or two in order to seek their response.
Yeah, I think, well, there's only a week we have, because we have to agree a report next week. Well, I mean, I've sensed, I mean, there are different views on this. My proposal is that we write to the government and ask for a response for next week and consider it on next week's agenda. Is that agreed? Live with that? Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. In that case, we move into private session.